So now we'll transition into our discussion of the kingdoms. As I'd mentioned before, I don't really use a very specific dating system for Egypt beyond the kingdoms. So you'll need to know Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. Pretty easy. But again, it's more complicated than this. So if you look up a list of the time periods online, let's say, you'll see that between each kingdom, there's an intermediary period where things sort of fall apart and then come back together. So I'll refer to that as we transition between the kingdoms. And again, there are the later outside groups that rule in Egypt, right? We will not be talking about them. So again, you can look up this information online if you want a little bit more depth, right, of discussion within the timeline. Now, how was the Old Kingdom? The Old Kingdom was a very prosperous time. So this was a time of great bounty for the Egyptian people. They had all the food they could eat. They had, abundant water. There was no famine. So this was a good time for them. And I always say, if you look at politics, when times are good, politicians, or in this case, pharaohs, they will use that. They will use that to build great monuments. They will use that to create significant propaganda because they have the resources available and they have the goodwill of the people as well. And you can't undervalue that. The goodwill of your people is very essential to what you can do as a leader. So, this time was a good time, and you also see really great monuments for this time. So, for our purposes, art historical purposes, right, that's why we see something like the pyramids that you see in the slide, because this was a time of great prosperity where you could leverage the ability to create something like this. So, good times, right, for the Egyptian people. They've been unified under Narmer, right, under the pre dynastic period is over. So, you have both Upper and Lower Egypt being unified into one Egypt, essentially, here in the Old Kingdom. Now, as we dive into the Old Kingdom, the first thing I wanted to talk about is the idea of burial in Egyptian society, because a lot of what we're going to look at here is related to the death customs of Egyptians. As I had mentioned previously, Egyptians lived to die. It was the biggest, most important event for them. I joke a lot that if you went to the Hallmark store in Egypt during this time period, right, if they'd had them, they would have death day cards that they would probably give to your family. Not birthday cards. Birth to them wasn't probably, again, a very significant event. It was your death, it was your journey into the afterlife that they were going to celebrate. So they had many rituals related to your death day, giving offerings to the dead on the anniversary of your death day. Everything was channeled towards your afterlife and the burial. So burial was very, very important to them. So we're going to look at some tombs. The first type of tomb that you see, and the tomb that is really used throughout Egyptian history for commoners, everyday people, is the mastaba or the mastaba form that you see here. And you're seeing many of them together in what we call a necropolis. So the actual burial structure, the mastaba, is for a family or an individual if you're very wealthy, but typically for a family, right? And they have, like, again, the graveyard idea, just like we do today, and they called it the necropolis. Now, break down the word. Polis is the Greek word for city, necro means death. So it is literally a city of the dead that you're creating with these complexes. The mastaba, I wanted to show you the form a little closer, right, so we can get a sense of what it looked like. It was a very basic, simple form. Again, these are really thought of as the all-purpose burial for anything from like a farmer up to whoever would want it, right? And you'll notice it has this flat top and sloped sides. It was typically made from mud brick. So this usually wasn't a stone structure. This was usually a mud brick structure. Not because the Egyptians were stone poor, but because this was something for a common person typically. So you weren't going to go for the huge investment of stone, quarrying it and shaping it and doing all of that. You were just going to make mud brick blocks, right? And then go from there. So typically mud bricks, sometimes you see stone, but most typically mud brick. And you'll notice if you look at this diagram, at the top part of the structure, actually in the structure, were things like your chapel, where your offerings will be given to the gods. This is where your relatives would come back to give your death day offerings. And then you'll see the false door, and then you'll see what looks like a little person kind of sitting back there. I'll get to that in a minute with a different slide. The top part of the mastaba, the actual structure, was there for rituals for, that purpose. Your body was actually buried, you'll notice, down below in the burial chamber. And one of the reasons that they separated your burial from your chapel, let's say, is because they were thinking about the idea of your tomb being desecrated or attacked in some way. That little person up in the mastaba, right, that is your Ka statue. And your Ka is your spirit, your soul. If you want to get really specific, there's the Ka and the Ba. So you can look this up if you want more information. For our purposes, I don't see the need to go into the Ba. Do extra research if you feel like it. But the idea of the Ka, the soul, this was essential to Egyptian thinking. Why even bother with making something for the afterlife, right? Why would you do that? Because you believe that your Ka, your soul, your spirit was going to live on, right, into the afterlife. So you had to have a place for your Ka to be safe and secure. You needed a place for your grave goods, right, your burial goods. So this was essential, right, to Egyptians to have a Ka statue. Now, why separate the Ka statue and the burial of your actual body? They felt that, if your Ka statue was desecrated, your body remained. So your soul still had somewhere to go, and vice versa. So if your body was attacked, your Ka statue remained. The worst thing to Egyptians was that if you had both your Ka statue and your body destroyed, you would become a wandering spirit. Very, very bad. So the Ka statue is very important to the soul being protected. If you go in these early tombs, you'll find all kinds of examples of grave goods, tomb art. I'm just showing you kind of a smattering of things here. But, each Egyptian received, no matter how poor they received some kind of grave goods, as we put it, something that either signified what they wanted to do in the afterlife or the sort of fun they were going to have, or sometimes it signified their profession during life, things they had done during life. So, it really was about like projecting, in a sense, what was going to happen to this person in their afterlife. Here you'll note this is what we call the solar boat painting. When you died in Egypt, your body would be mummified. You'll see the mummy kind of floating in there. And we'll talk about mummification a little bit further on when we get to King Tut. That's where I place that discussion. So if you're like, why aren't we going to talk about mummies yet? We'll get there, don't worry. Um, so you see the mummy in the solar boat. And when an Egyptian died, they had to have their body transition to the land of the dead. They were sun god worshippers. They believed in Ra, the creator, the sun god. So think about it. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So everything was oriented for Egyptians along these lines, with the idea that the east was the land of the living and the west was the land of the dead. So all the necropoli would have been on the western side of the Nile. All the places where Egyptians lived, their cities, they're on the eastern side of the Nile, land of the living, land of the dead. When you died, your body was placed on the solar boat and you were transitioned across the Nile River like you were crossing a boundary from the living side to the dead, and then, placed inside your tomb. So it was very symbolic of their beliefs about the river, the Nile, being, in a sense, this transition point between life and death, and then creating a whole culture that revolved around, this idea of living, death, east, west. So follow the trajectory of the sun, and you get the point. And they would have little models of solar boats that would be inside the tomb. We'll look at Pharaoh Khufu, and he will actually have his entire solar boat buried next to his tomb. So, he's a pharaoh. He can have the boat if he wants it. So it speaks to his, wealth, his status. And here's another little carving from the tomb of T, which shows T, we'd assume, hunting. So I'd mentioned that sometimes your grave goods would reflect like what you may want to hope to do in your afterlife. T seemed to be interested in having some fun going out on a hippo hunt. Because if you look at the bottom little blue band, there's these little hippos down there cavorting around in the waters. And he has his servants, you'll notice, doing the hunt. I'd mentioned before, we'll talk about the canon of proportions. Notice that his body is very rigid, and then the bodies of his servants are very loose and naturalistic. So, where we think naturalism is the pinnacle of depiction, they actually thought it was for people lesser than you, remember? And that rigidity, that sort of very static, locked body that you see T having, he also has bigger hierarchy of scale, if you note. They thought that that was how you showed people who had power, who had control. So it's a little bit of a different flip, maybe, than how we talk about stylization versus realism or naturalism ourselves. So grave goods, very important to Egyptians. Now, I showed you the mastaba also so you could think about how tomb architecture progresses. It has that flat top and those sloped sides. Pharaohs, of course, were going to say, well, I want something more impressive than just an everyday mastaba in an everyday necropolis. So one of the earliest Old Kingdom pharaohs, Pharaoh Dozier, he takes on this idea of, I want something bigger and better. He has his architect, Imhotep, who you'll notice the first named artist we run into in art history. So that is an important detail to note, that we have somebody who is named as the architect or the artist, right, of the piece. He has Imhotep think up something a little bit grander for him, and we get the stepped pyramid. You'll notice that the mastaba idea is used, but then it's almost like it's stacked, like stairs. And I always think of it like, it's supposed to be like a staircase leading him up to reunite with Ra or to reunite with the sun god. So the idea of like step on up, and reunite with your gods. You'll also note that there are these little buildings in front of the step pyramid, and these are meant to emulate the idea of shops. So it's almost like he had his own little shopping complex or his own little village created to be somewhere he could navigate in his afterlife. So, he wanted it all. He wanted something grand and amazing and, just really kind of um, large in purpose to navigate in his afterlife. So he wanted Imhotep to create something bigger, grander, more special. But note the pyramid shape is something that I said, because of the Ben, we think kind of drives symbology in Egypt. So it's sort of starting to look like a pyramid, but not quite yet. So I would say there's these steps that you have to see, literally steps you have to see as the progression of tomb building. Starting with the mastaba, going to the step pyramid, and then finally getting to the true pyramids at the end. That there is a sense of how to create something through that progression. Um, so again, he's thinking in a larger scale about the ideas of the step pyramid. Then you go on to look at Seneferu, and he is famous for his bent pyramids. So here we think what happened is his architects started to consider, like, how can you make a true pyramid, but wasn't quite getting there yet. So there is some rocky, steps to take along the road until you get to finally, right, the true pyramid that you see here.